The night Clara Whitmore was thrown out of her own family, she was wearing a dress that had never fit her right. Her mother's voice cut through the lamplight like a blade, and every eye in that crowded hall turned to watch a young woman's world collapse. But here is what those eyes missed. Clara did not fall. And somewhere on the dark road between that ballroom and a cold, forgotten shack on the edge of everything, she made a decision that would change the shape of her entire life. What happens next is the kind of story that reminds you why the human spirit is the most unbreakable thing on this earth. Stay with us until the very end. Drop a comment below with the city you're watching from tonight, and hit that like button so more people can find this story. The Spring Gala was the one night of the year when the town of Millhaven forgot its troubles and remembered its ambitions. The Oakhurst Assembly Hall, which on ordinary evenings smelled of sawdust and boot leather, had been transformed over the course of an entire week into something that aspired to grandeur. Silk ribbons the color of buttercups were strung from the raftered ceiling. Beeswax candles burned in iron sconces along every wall, casting a warm and generous light over the assembled townspeople, a light that smoothed over imperfections, softened hard faces, and made even the most ordinary things appear almost beautiful. Almost. Clara Whitmore stood at the edge of the room near the long refreshment table, and she was doing the things she had learned to do in every crowded public space since childhood. She was making herself small. It was a tremendous effort for a woman of her particular build, an effort that required a constant low-grade vigilance, a perpetual holding in of breath and rounding of shoulders, and careful measured steps that took up as little of the world's floor space as possible. She was 26 years old, powerfully built through the shoulders and back from years of genuine physical labor, and she stood 5 feet and 9 inches in her stocking feet, which meant she stood eye level with most of the men in the room and a clear head above many of the women. She was, by any honest accounting, a formidable presence in a room, the kind of woman who, in a different century or on a different continent, might have been celebrated for her strength, her capacity, the sheer physical capability of her frame. But this was Millhaven in the year of our Lord, 1887, and in Millhaven a woman's worth was measured in entirely different terms. The dress had been her mother's idea, as most of the worst ideas in Clara's life had been. It was a frilly thing in pale lavender, with puffed sleeves designed for a narrower woman, and a bodice meant to cinch a waist that Clara's particular architecture was simply not built to cinch. Her mother, Adeline Whitmore, had declared it perfect with the absolute conviction of a woman who has never allowed a contradicting fact to enter her mind when a preferred opinion was available. Clara had said nothing. She rarely said anything when her mother used that tone. She had simply stood still while the hooks were fastened along her back one by one, each one a small act of compression. And she had breathed carefully and told herself that it was only one evening, that she could endure one evening, that she had endured worse. She was, as it turned out, wrong about that last part. The evening had proceeded in the way such evenings always did. The Millhaven citizens moved in their familiar constellations. Men gravitating toward the cider and the business talk along the south wall, women clustering in their carefully arranged social hierarchies near the windows, and the young people attempting the social rituals of courtship with varying degrees of grace. Clara had positioned herself near the refreshment table because it gave her something to do with her hands and a reason to stand apart from the central activity of the room without appearing to actively avoid it. She had been handed a glass of cider she didn't particularly want, and she had been watching the candles drip slow trails of wax down their iron holders, and she had been thinking, as she often did in these moments, about a particularly challenging mending job. She had, waiting back at the house, a split seam on old Mr. Hargreaves' winter coat that would require some creative work with a herringbone stitch. She did not see the young boy who came barreling through the gap between her and the table. He could not have been more than 7 or 8, engaged in some private pursuit that had nothing to do with the careful social choreography of his elders, and he ran directly into the back of Clara's knees at a full sprint. The physics of what happened next were entirely predictable and entirely unstoppable. Clara lurched forward, her substantial weight shifting suddenly and without warning, and her left hand, the one holding the glass, swung wide in a reflexive attempt to regain her balance, and the glass connected with the edge of the large silver tray that held the row of punch cups, and the tray tilted, and the cups slid, and the crimson punch arced outward in a terrible, graceful, slow-motion catastrophe that seemed to Clara in the horrible, stretched moment of its unfolding to take approximately forever to complete itself. The crash, when it came, was enormous. Or perhaps it only seemed enormous because the room had gone so completely, devastatingly silent in the half-second before it. Clara stood in the wreckage of scattered cups and spreading red stain, and she felt the collective gaze of Millhaven settle on her like a physical weight. She felt her face go hot. She felt her hands begin to shake very slightly, and she tightened them into fists at her sides to stop it. She opened her mouth to apologize, to say something to begin the process of making this right. She never got the chance. Her mother appeared at her elbow with the speed of a woman who had been watching from across the room and had crossed it in a state of cold, controlled fury. Adeline Whitmore was a small woman, narrow through the shoulders and precise in all her movements, and she wore her social dignity like armor, which meant that any threat to it, any public embarrassment connected to her name, was treated by her nervous system as something very close to a mortal wound. She took Clara by the arm, her fingers pressing in hard enough to leave marks, and she turned her face to her daughter, and what Clara saw there was not concern, and it was not sorrow, and it was not even ordinary anger. It was contempt. Pure, practiced, long-harbored contempt that had apparently only been waiting for an occasion sufficiently public to merit its full expression. "Look at you," Adeline said, and her voice was pitched low, but the room was silent enough that it carried, and Clara knew it carried because she could see it on the faces of the women nearest them, that particular expression of fascinated horror that people wear when they are watching something terrible happen to someone else. "You have the grace of a cart horse and the sense to match. I have spent 26 years trying to make something presentable out of you, and you stand there and prove to every soul in this room exactly what I have always known." She paused, and her grip on Clara's arm tightened fractionally. "You are a lumbering embarrassment. You will never be a proper woman, not in this lifetime." The words fell into the silence of the room like stones into still water, and Clara felt the ripples of them move outward through the crowd, watched the faces shift and resettle, watched some look away in discomfort, watched others, the crueler ones, not look away at all. She did not cry. She would think about that later in the long, difficult nights that followed, and she would find something important in it, something worth holding on to. She did not cry. What she felt in that suspended, terrible moment was a sensation she had no precise word for, a kind of interior cleaving, as though something had been cut loose from its moorings inside her chest, something that had been straining against its tether for a very long time, and had finally, with a clean and final snap, come free. It was not relief exactly. It was more complicated than relief. It was the feeling of a door closing, and the sound it made was not a slam, but a quiet, definitive click. She removed her mother's hand from her arm. She did it carefully, using both her own hands, lifting each of Adeline's fingers individually, as though she were unwrapping something delicate, and she set her mother's hand aside and stepped back one step, and then she looked at the room, at all the watching faces, and she said nothing at all. There was nothing to say. Everything that needed to be said had already been said, and the part that was true she already knew, and the part that was false she intended to spend the rest of her life proving wrong. She turned and walked to the door. She did not hurry. She did not look back. The night air hit her face like cold water, and she kept walking. She walked for 2 hours in the dark in the ill-fitting lavender dress, and by the time she reached the edge of the Whitmore property, she had made several decisions. The most important of them was this: she was not going back inside that house. Not tonight. Not to sleep under a roof that belonged to a woman who had, just in the fullest sense of the phrase, made her meaning plain. The shack was at the far edge of what had once been the Whitmore land, near the creek line, where the old cottonwood trees grew thick and the ground was soft with years of fallen leaves. It had belonged at various points in its history to a farmhand who had come through one winter and then moved on, and then briefly to a family of raccoons who had been evicted by her grandfather's dog, and then to no one in particular for the better part of a decade. The roof was drafty. The single window had been repaired so many times with so many different materials that it was essentially a patchwork of translucent solutions. The door hung slightly crooked on its hinges and had to be lifted and pushed simultaneously to close properly. Clara stood in the doorway of it with a candle she had taken from the assembly hall still burning in one hand, and her grandmother's sewing kit tucked under her arm, the only thing she had thought to retrieve from the house before she had turned and kept walking. And she looked at the shack, and the shack looked back at her, and she thought, "This is mine." Not because it belonged to her in any legal sense, not because anyone had given it to her, but because she had decided, standing in its doorway with the cold smell of the creek coming up through the dark, that she was going to make it hers, and in her experience the decision was always the first and most essential step. She went inside and set the candle on the old wooden table that sat in the center of the room, and she sat down on the single chair, and she opened her grandmother's sewing kit and looked at its contents, the needles and the thread and the thimbles and the small sharp scissors, and she took stock. What she had her hands, her training, which had been extensive because her grandmother, unlike her mother, had believed that useful knowledge was a form of dignity. A sewing kit. The dress on her back, which she intended to take apart and use for material because she had several other more practical garments at the house that she would retrieve during daylight hours when her mother was occupied elsewhere. A candle. A roof, even a drafty one. The particular quality of determination that she had discovered in the last 2 hours of walking through the cold dark she possessed in quantities she had not previously been asked to measure. What she needed: work. She would deal with the work in the morning. She slept that night on the floor of the shack with her coat folded under her head, and she woke before dawn because the cold came through the floorboards with an intention that she could only respect, and she lay there in the gray pre-light and listened to the creek and the cottonwood leaves and thought through the problem of her life with the same focused attention she gave to a complicated mending challenge. The problem, reduced to its essentials, was not the one her mother imagined it to be. Her mother believed the problem was that Clara was not the kind of woman the world wanted her to be. But Clara had spent the long, dark walk to the shack reconsidering this formulation, and she had arrived at a different conclusion. The problem was that she had been trying to be the wrong shape, not the wrong physical shape, though her mother had certainly implied it. The wrong shape entirely. She had been trying to fit into a mold that had never been designed for her, and she had been expending enormous energy on this effort, and the energy was wasted, and the mold was never going to fit, and it was time past time to stop. She would build something instead, something that fit the shape she actually was. Over the next 3 days, she worked with the methodical focus of a woman who has a plan and knows the plan is the only thing between her and genuine catastrophe. She retrieved her practical clothes from the house during a window when her mother was at her morning calls. She patched the worst of the drafts in the shack's walls using strips of heavy canvas she found in the old barn nearby. She repaired the crooked door hinge using a technique her grandfather had shown her involving a bent nail and considerable patience. She cleaned the single window until it let in what light was available. She built a small fire in the iron stove that sat in the corner of the room, and she was gratified to discover that the stovepipe, though rusted, was still functional. And then she wrote in careful letters on a piece of brown paper bag that she tacked to the outside of the now properly closing door, "Whitmore Mending. Fair price, fair work, She set her rate at what she believed was honest, not cheap enough to invite the kind of patrons who believed that a woman working alone could be taken advantage of, not high enough to turn away the working men who were her actual realistic customer base. She thought about this carefully because she understood with a clarity that her current situation had sharpened to a fine edge, that she could afford exactly one kind of patron mistake too few customers. She could not afford too few, and she could not afford the kind of trouble that came with some other varieties of business. The first customer came on the fourth day. He was a miner named Gus who lived in the boarding house on the other side of the creek and who had a pair of heavy canvas work trousers with a split seam that ran from the right knee most of the way up the inseam, which rendered them unwearable, and which he could not replace until his next pay came in, which was 11 days away. He stood at her door with his hat in his hands and his good trousers on and his bad ones folded under his arm, and he looked at the sign, and then he looked at Clara, and then he named a price that was slightly less than what she had posted. "No," Clara said. "The price on the sign is the price." He considered this for a moment. "It's a fair price," he allowed. "Yes," she said. "It is." He paid it. She did the work that evening by candlelight, a careful and thorough repair that reinforced the weakest points of the seam against future stress, and when he came back the next morning he held the trousers up and examined them and said, "Better than new," which was not quite true but was close enough to be a real compliment. And he told 2 men at the mine about her that afternoon, which she knew because both of them appeared at her door by the end of the week. This was how it began. In those first weeks, the work was enough to keep her fed barely, and the shack was cold but not uninhabitable, and she developed systems and routines with the focused intentionality of someone who understands that systems and routines are what stand between a person and the abyss. She woke at first light. She stoked the stove. She worked until the light was gone, and then she worked by candlelight for another hour or two, taking on no more work than she could complete well, but no less than she could survive on. She allowed herself no luxuries and no self-pity, which were, she had decided, 2 sides of the same coin, both of them distractions from the essential work of staying alive. She established her rules early, and she posted them in her mind as prominently as she had posted the sign on her door. The first and most important rule was honest work for honest pay. She would not undercharge. She would not overcharge. She would do what she agreed to do, and she would do it to the highest standard of which she was capable, and she would accept payment for it without apology or excessive gratitude, because both of those responses suggested that the transaction was somehow a favor when it was in fact a fair exchange between 2 people of equal standing. The second rule was harder to live by but more important: to hold no charity. She knew people talked about her. She knew some of them felt sorry for her, the Whitmore girl living alone in that old shack, cast out by her own mother. She could see it sometimes in the careful way certain women from town looked at her when she walked to the general store, a kind of pitying softness that made her skin prickle with discomfort. Twice in the first month she found things left on her doorstep, a wrapped portion of pie once, and a small bundle of dried herbs another time, both of them left anonymously, both of them intended with kindness. She left them both on the doorstep of the Hargreave house, which was the nearest residence, along with a note that said, "Only found on my step. Thought these might be yours." She did not know for certain that the Hargreaves had left them. She suspected not. But she could not keep them, and she could not throw them away, and it seemed important that they go somewhere, that the kindness of whoever had left them not simply dissolve into nothing, while also making clear to whatever silent audience might be watching that Clara Whitmore was not a woman who lived on the charity of neighbors. It was a principle that cost her something genuinely, because there were evenings in that first month when the fire was low and the supper was thin, and the cold came through the patched walls with a persistence that felt almost personal, and she sat by the stove in the most economical position to absorb its warmth. And she thought about the pie and the warmth it would have provided, and she felt the full weight of the choice she had made. And then she stoked the fire with the last of her wood and went back to her work, because the work was what she had, and the work was what would get her through. This is the part of the story that is difficult to convey the texture of those early weeks, the specific quality of the loneliness and the cold and the effort that went into each ordinary day. It was not dramatic suffering. It was the other kind, the grinding, cumulative, relentless kind, the kind that is made not of great blows, but of an endless succession of small difficulties, each one of them manageable on its own, but compounding over days and weeks into something that required a particular brand of stubbornness to simply continue facing every morning. Clara faced it. Every morning she woke up, and she faced it, and she got the fire going, and she made her tea, and she sat down to work. This is what strength actually looks like, not in the grand gestures and the public moments, but in the 10,000 private choices to simply keep going when the alternative would be so much easier. She had been in the shack for 6 weeks when she got her first look at Caleb Boone. She knew the name as everyone in the valley knew it. Dry Creek Ranch was the largest single operation in the county, had been for the better part of 2 decades, and Caleb Boone had taken it over from his father at the age of 24, when the older man's health had made the transition necessary, and had, by most accounts that reached Clara's ears, proceeded to run it with the same quiet competence his father had shown, and possibly with more strategic intelligence. He was 32 now. He was not particularly tall and not particularly broad, a lean, weathered man who moved with the economy of someone who has spent a great deal of time in rough terrain and learned to conserve effort. He had dark hair and a jaw that seemed to have been designed with a certain refusal built into it, and his eyes were the particular dark gray-brown of creek water in autumn. He came on a Tuesday morning, which was her quietest day, arriving on horseback with a saddlebag over one arm and stopping in front of her sign and reading it with the same thoroughness he appeared to apply to most things. Then he dismounted, tied his horse to the post she had driven into the ground for that purpose, and knocked on her open door. "Miss Whitmore?" "Yes," she said, setting down her work. He reached into the saddlebag and produced a bundled collection of items that turned out, when laid on her cutting table, to be 3 torn canvas overcoats, 2 lengths of harness leather in need of stitching, and a pair of heavy work trousers with a blown-out knee. He set them out with the methodical care of a man who has made a list and is working through it, and then he looked at her with those creek water eyes and said, without preamble, "I heard you do good work." "I do honest work," she said, which was her standard correction. "Good is for the customer to judge." He looked at the items on the table and then at her. "Can you handle canvas and leather both?" "Yes." "What's your rate?" She named it. He nodded once without negotiating, which was unusual enough that she noted it. Most men in her experience negotiated as a matter of principle the way they might take their hat off indoors simply because it was the expected form. He did not. He reached into his coat pocket and produced his wallet and counted out payment in advance, which was rarer still. She looked at the money on her table and then at him. "I haven't done the work yet," she said. "No," he agreed. "But the sign says fair price, fair work. I'm paying a fair price. I trust you'll do fair work." He picked up his hat from where he had set it on the edge of the table. "I'll come back in a week." He turned and went back to his horse, and she watched him go with the odd sensation of having encountered something she did not quite have a category for, something that required a new drawer in the filing system she used to organize her understanding of the world. He came back in a week. She had done all of it, the canvas coats carefully repaired with a tight lock stitch that would hold against wind and weather, the harness leather stitched with waxed thread that would resist moisture, the trousers with a reinforced knee patch that she had cut from a scrap of matching canvas and applied in a way that was both functional and she thought not unattractive. He examined each piece with the same thoroughness he had brought to reading her sign, turning them in his hands, checking the stitching, and he said, "This is good work." "Thank you," she said, which was the first time in recent memory that she had said those words without the complicated weight of obligation attached to them, because it was a professional acknowledgment, and she had earned it professionally, and that was all it was. "I'll have more," he said. "I'll be here," she said. And that was the whole of their first month of acquaintance. He came back 3 times, each time with a new collection of items, each time paying in advance, each time examining the completed work with careful attention and saying something simple and direct about its quality. And she received those assessments with the same equanimity. She received his payment as a professional exchange between 2 people who both understood the value of what was being transacted. She did not analyze it overmuch at the time. She did not have the luxury of overthinking any particular element of her daily existence. The whole of her attention was required for the management of the whole. But she was aware somewhere beneath the surface of her working consciousness of the way he looked at her when he came to the door, which was directly without that particular sideways quality that characterized the gaze of most of the other men she dealt with, the quality that communicated that they were looking at something that needed to be evaluated and categorized and assigned its proper degree of concern or dismissal. He just looked at her, the way you look at a person. She noticed it the way you notice a window that lets in more light than you expected, not with drama, but with a quiet adjustment of perception that stays with you after. The storm came on a Thursday night in early November, when the temperature had dropped sharply over the course of the afternoon and the sky had taken on the particular heavy flat coloring that the old-timers called iron weather. Clara had been watching it build all evening with the attention of someone who lives in a shack and has a practical stake in meteorological developments, and she had spent the late afternoon securing, what she could, her materials chest weighted down with rocks, her work materials brought inside and stacked in the driest corner, the window boards reinforced as best she could manage. But she had not fully anticipated the wind. It came in from the northwest after midnight with an intensity that made the whole structure shudder a deep, bone-level vibration, as if the shack were reconsidering its own foundations, and within 20 minutes of its arrival, the heavy tarp she had stretched over the section of roof above her work area. The section where the shingles were most compromised began to tear loose at the left corner where she had secured it to the wall. She heard it go a rapid, rhythmic snapping sound beneath the shriek of the wind like a flag in a hurricane, and she was out the door and into the freezing rain before she had finished the full thought of what needed to be done. The cold hit her like a wall. The rain was not heavy, but it was driven by the wind into something close to solid, and within seconds her face was wet, and her hands were numb at the fingertips, and the tarp above her was a wild thrashing thing, a 10-foot square of canvas with ideas of its own, and she could see that the right side was still secured and the left was free. And if she could just get to the free corner and pull it back down and tie it off, she could manage this, she could hold it. She got to the ladder she had left propped against the wall for exactly this kind of situation, and she went up. It one-handed, the other hand holding the trailing end of the tarp rope, and she reached the edge of the roof, and the wind hit her with its full force, staggering her, and she planted her feet and set her broad shoulders against it, and she did not fall. She was trying to work out the problem of the leverage she could grab the tarp corner, but she could not simultaneously anchor the rope without letting go of the ladder, and the wind was making the tarp's movement unpredictable in a way that made timing the grab difficult when she heard the sound of hooves over the wind, and she looked down, and Caleb Boone was there. He was already off his horse and moving before she fully processed his presence, and he grabbed the corner of the rope at the ground level and looked up at her and shouted over the wind, his voice flat and practical and stripped of everything except the essential information. "Hold your line tight. I've got this end." She held her line tight. He worked the ground end of the rope around the iron stake she had driven into the ground for exactly this purpose, and she pulled the tarp corner back down and secured it to the roof hook she had installed last month, in anticipation of exactly this scenario, and then she secured her own end of the rope with 3 wraps and a knot. Her grandfather had taught her for situations involving both cold hands and the requirement that the knot not come loose, and when she came down the ladder, her hands were bleeding where the rope had pulled across the palms. She stood in the rain and looked at her hands. "You're bleeding," Caleb said. "I know," she said. "The rope." He looked at the secured tarp which was holding the canvas pulled drum-tight between its 4 points, and then at her. "Come inside," he said. "Get your hands wrapped." "I'll manage," she said, which was true, and also her first response to most offers of help, a reflex so deeply worn into her that it operated largely independently of conscious decision. "I'm sure you will," he said. There was no argument in his tone, and no insistence, just an acknowledgement that she was probably right, and a continued presence that suggested he intended to stay regardless. He was soaked through, she noticed. They both were. "You'd better come in then," she said, because leaving a man in the rain in November was not something she was prepared to do regardless of any other considerations. "I'll make tea." Inside, with the stove going and the tarp holding against the wind that pressed at the roof with a steady testing pressure, she wrapped her hands with strips of clean cloth and made tea, and Caleb Boone sat in the single chair as though he sat in single chairs in other people's spaces every day, and looked at the work on her table with an attention that was, she noted, professional rather than personal. He was looking at her work the way he looked at everything, with the direct assessment of a man who respects what he is examining. "I need to pay you for tonight," she said when the tea was done, and her hands were wrapped and the shack had settled into a slightly less embattled rhythm. He looked at her. "For what? Your time, your help with the tarp." He was quiet for a moment, in the way that had come to be recognizable as his particular way of thinking, not a pause, but a considered settling. "I just fired my ranch tailor," he said. Man couldn't stitch a straight line if the thread was a river and the needle was a boat. He looked at the pile of canvas sections she had finished for him last month and that he hadn't yet collected. "I've got 7 winter wagon tarps that need patching before the freeze sets in hard. 2 weeks of work, probably, if you've got the time." She waited. "Call it even," he said. "Your work on the tarps for my time tonight." She thought about this for 3 full seconds. It was a fair trade. The work was genuinely what he said it was 2 weeks' worth at a fair rate, and his time tonight had been genuinely valuable, more valuable than she was comfortable admitting, because without him she was not certain she could have managed the leverage problem before the tarp went entirely, and if the tarp had gone, the roof damage might have compromised the space in which her work materials were stored, which would have meant a loss she was not currently positioned to absorb. It was a fair trade. Her pride, such as it was, remained intact because it was not charity. It was a transaction. "Fair enough," she said. He nodded once with the same economy he brought to everything. "I'll send the tarps tomorrow." He left when the rain eased enough to make the ride back to Dry Creek manageable, and she stood in the doorway and watched him go, and then she went inside and sat down by the stove and looked at her wrapped hands resting in her lap, and she thought about the evening, and she felt something she did not immediately have a name for, something warm and careful and slightly alarmed, the way you feel when you realize you have been standing on a bridge and not noticing the water below. She went back to her work. The tarps arrived the next morning, 7 of them, heavy canvas rectangles in varying states of damage, some with small tears and some with holes large enough to put a fist through. She looked at them piled in the corner of her shack and catalogued the work they represented and found herself unexpectedly pleased by it. Not just by the security of the income, though, that was real and significant, but by the work itself, by the scale of it, by the sense of something genuinely substantial to set her hands to. She began that morning, and she worked with the focused satisfaction of someone engaged in a task equal to their full capability. She did not let herself think about the way he had shouted over the wind. "Hold your line tight." "I've got this end." She did not let herself examine the particular quality of the warmth she had felt at those words, the recognition embedded in them, the assumption that she was capable and would hold her end and did not need to be rescued, only assisted. She did not let herself think about any of that with the direct naming kind of thought. But her hands, working steady and sure through the heavy canvas with the waxed thread, knew what they knew. And somewhere in the cold November air of the shack, in the smell of canvas and beeswax and the sound of the creek running fast with yesterday's rain, something new was beginning to take shape, small and careful and not yet named, but real. The way the first thread pulled through the eye of a needle is real, a beginning, and the promise of something whole. The tarps took her 11 days, not 14, because Clara Whitmore, once she had a clear task in front of her, worked with a focus that tended to compress time. She finished the last one on a Wednesday afternoon, folded all 7 with the careful precision she applied to everything that would leave her hands and carry her name into the world, and arranged them in a stack near the door. She stood back and looked at them, and she felt the quiet satisfaction of completed work, the particular kind of peace that comes not from rest, but from the honest expenditure of effort towards something real. She sent word to Dry Creek Ranch through Gus, who passed by the road to the ranch on his way to the mine each morning, and 2 days later, a ranch hand she had not seen before arrived with a wagon and loaded the tarps with the careless speed of a man who has a dozen other things to do before noon. He left without much conversation, which suited her fine. She was already thinking about the alterations job she had taken on for the Hendersons, 3 of their boys, growing faster than their mother could keep up with, and a pile of trousers that needed letting down at the hem. But the rhythm she had settled into, the contained, self-sufficient rhythm of her days, shifted in a way she had not planned for when 4 days after the tarps left. Caleb Boone himself rode up to her door in the late morning with a different kind of proposition. She heard the horse first, and then his knock on the open door frame, and she set down her work and looked up, and there he was, hat in hand, as was his habit, and she noticed, as she always did, that he looked at her directly. Not at the space beside her, not at a point slightly above her head, not with that sideways quality she associated with the particular discomfort some people felt in the presence of a woman who did not fit their expectations. Directly at her. The way you look at a person you intend to speak with honestly. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I have a proposal, a business one." "Sit down then," she said, because she had the second chair. Now a 3-legged affair, she had repaired herself from a pile of old wood she had found behind the barn, and she gestured to it, and he sat. The proposal was this: the ranch had 6 cowhands who would need full winter gear outfitted by the first hard freeze, which the weather was currently suggesting might arrive ahead of schedule. In addition to the standard patching and repair work, several of the men needed new canvas work coats made to measure, because the previous tailor had been producing garments with the structural integrity of wet paper, and 2 of the cowhands had complained of splitting seams in conditions that required their gear to hold. There was also the question of measuring the men for their winter underlayers, which Caleb handled through a dry goods merchant in town, but which required accurate measurements he had not previously bothered to take, because the previous tailor had not bothered to ask. He laid all of this out in the direct sequenced way he had, as if he were describing the contents of an inventory, and when he was done, he looked at her and said, "This would require you to come out to the ranch. Probably 2 days of work on site, possibly 3. I'd provide board." Clara folded her hands in her lap and considered the proposal with the same careful attention she gave to any business negotiation, which meant she set aside the part of her that noted the way the November light came through the window at that particular angle and made the gray in his eyes look almost silver, and she focused on the practical structure of what he was offering. "What's the rate?" she asked. He named a figure for the coats. She named a higher one. He considered it for approximately 4 seconds, and then said, "Fair enough." And she understood again that he was not negotiating for the pleasure of the contest, but had assessed her number on its merits, and found it reasonable. "I'll need to see the materials before I can commit to a timeline," she said. "Of course. And I'll calculate the cost of the board separately and deduct it from the final payment." He paused at this, just briefly, barely perceptibly, but she caught it. "That's not necessary," he said. "It is," she said, with the same even tone she used for everything neither combative nor apologetic. "Those are my terms." He looked at her for a moment, and she had the sense that he was reassessing something, rearranging some interior calculation, and then he nodded once, and it was settled. She arrived at Dry Creek Ranch on a Monday morning with her work bag over one shoulder and her measurement book in her coat pocket, and she took in the scope of the operation with the quick, practical eye she had developed for assessing a new working environment. The main house was a long, solid structure of timber and stone that had the look of something built to last rather than to impress. The barn was enormous and well-maintained, the kind of barn that reflects the character of the man who runs what goes inside it. The bunkhouse sat across the yard from the main house, and it was from there that the sounds of early morning ranch work emanated, the low voices of men, the creak of leather, the particular dense smell of horses and hay and cold air. Caleb met her in the yard and walked her to the bunkhouse without preamble, and she followed him across the frozen ground and thought about measuring tapes and coat patterns and did not think about the way his stride had a quality of complete self-possession, a man entirely at home in his own territory. The cowhands were 6 in total, and they regarded her arrival with the range of responses she had come to expect from rough-working men encountering a woman in a professional context. 2 of them were indifferent. 2 were mildly curious when a young man of perhaps 19 named Petey was visibly uncertain in the way of someone who has not yet worked out the social protocol for a situation he hasn't encountered before. And one, the oldest of them, a weathered man named Roy, who had the look of someone who has been on ranches all his life and has learned to assess new elements quickly. Nodded at her with a respect that was immediate and unqualified. "Miss Whitmore's here to outfit your winter gear," Caleb said. "You'll cooperate with her measurements and her instructions. Any questions?" There were no questions. This was, she understood, partly because of Caleb's tone, which left very little oxygen in the room for questions, and partly because these were men who understood work and could recognize she suspected another person who did. She set her bag on the long bunkhouse table and produced her measurement tape and her notebook, and she looked at the assembled men and said, "I'll take you one at a time. Tell me about your work and what your gear needs to do and where your old gear has failed you, and we'll go from there." This, it turned out, was the right approach. Men who might have been uncomfortable with the simple mechanics of being measured relaxed almost immediately when asked about function and failure, because function and failure were things they understood and had opinions about. And within the first hour, she had not only the measurements she needed, but a detailed practical knowledge of what the men's work actually demanded of their clothing, which informed her pattern choices in ways that a purely numbers-based approach would not have. Roy's old coat had always split at the right shoulder because Roy was broader on the right side than the left, a slight asymmetry from 20 years of rope work. She noted this and adjusted her pattern accordingly. "Petey ran hot," he said apologetically, as if this were an embarrassing personal failing, and she told him without inflection that a vented back panel would manage that, and he looked relieved in the way of someone who has been given a technical solution to a problem they had previously categorized as a character flaw. She worked through the morning and into the afternoon, and by the time the early dark of November began to settle over the ranch, she had her measurements, her notes, her materials, assessment, and a clear picture of what needed to be done. She had dinner in the main house that evening at a table that was not large but was solid in a kitchen that had the feel of a room used for actual cooking rather than display. Caleb made the meal himself, which surprised her, though she kept the surprise interior. It was a simple meal: a pot of beans with salt pork, cornbread, coffee, the food of a working man who eats what sustains him and does not particularly concern himself with what impresses. She ate it with genuine appreciation and said so because she had been working since before dawn and the food was hot and honest. "You cook your own meals," she said. It was not quite a question. "Ranch cook quit in September," he said. "Haven't hired another one?" "Why not?" He looked at his coffee. "Haven't found one who does it right." She thought about this for a moment. "What does right mean for you?" He considered the question with the same gravity he appeared to bring to all questions. "Honest," he said finally. "Good food is honest food. You know what's in it and why. No pretense." She thought about that while she finished her cornbread, and she thought it was one of the more interesting things she had heard said about food, and she thought it was also not entirely about food. And she filed it away in the drawer she was building for him in her interior organizational system. The drawer that was getting, she noticed, somewhat fuller than she had originally allocated space for. She was given the small room off the kitchen for her stay, a room that was spare but clean and had a proper bed and a hook on the wall for her coat, and she lay awake for a while in the dark, listening to the ranch sounds settle into the quiet of late night, the horses in the barn, the wind off the hills, the occasional low voice of the night hand making his rounds, and she thought about her shack and the work waiting there, and the Henderson boys' hymns, and the particular quality of satisfaction she felt about the day's work, the measurements taken and the problems understood, and the solutions already forming themselves in her mind. She slept better than she had in weeks. The rain started the next morning before dawn. She heard it on the roof of the small room and lay still for a moment assessing its quality, because rain in November in this part of the valley had a range of meanings depending on its character, and this one had the sound of something that intended to continue. She got up and looked out the small window and saw the yard had already begun to run with water, and the sky was the flat, determined gray of a weather system with nothing to prove, and all the time in the world. She went to the kitchen and stoked the stove and put coffee on because it was there and she was awake and it was something useful to do, and when Caleb appeared in the doorway 20 minutes later and stopped at the sight of the already hot stove and the coffee ready. She said, without looking up from her work materials she had spread on the kitchen table, "The road to town will be out by midday, if this keeps up." "Yes, Woods," he said. He went to the window and looked at the yard where the water was now running in earnest along the low places in the ground. Probably already out. She absorbed this information with the practical focus it deserved. She was functionally stranded. This fact had implications for her schedule, for her other clients, for the Henderson boys' hymns, and the cost of board she had negotiated as a deduction, all of which she would need to recalibrate. She was for the moment exactly where she was and would be here until the rain stopped and the road drained, and those were the facts of the situation, and she was a woman who dealt with facts. "I'll start on the coats today," she said. "I can work here if your kitchen table is available." "It's available," he said. And so the days at Dry Creek Ranch extended themselves. She worked at the kitchen table through the morning, cutting her patterns and beginning the initial construction of the canvas coats with the quiet, focused efficiency of someone for whom concentration is a natural state. The men came and went from the bunkhouse to the barn, continuing the work of the ranch with the practical adaptability of people who cannot afford to stop simply because the weather has opinions. Clara could see them through the kitchen window moving across the muddy yard in their old inadequate gear, and she felt a professional urgency that sharpened her work even further. She went out to the bunkhouse in the afternoon to take delivery of the heavy bolts of oiled canvas that Caleb had in his supply shed, and she carried them back 2 at a time, the 40-pound rolls draped over her broad shoulders, and when Petey scrambled up to help her with the second load, she handed him a roll without any particular ceremony, and they carried the rest of it together in 3 more trips, working with the easy economy of 2 people who both understand the logistics of moving heavy materials. Roy watched this from the bunkhouse doorway and said nothing, but when she passed him he gave her a nod of the kind that means, "I see what you're doing, and I respect it," and she received it in the spirit in which it was offered. By the 3rd day, she had 2 coats fully assembled, and 3 more in their intermediate stages, and she had also, in the time that the rain kept them all close to the buildings and the rhythm of the ranch shaped itself around the storm, begun to understand the working life of this place with a clarity that came from proximity. She understood the way the men moved around Caleb, not with fear and not with simple deference, but with a kind of trust, the particular trust that develops between people who have worked through difficult things together and know each other's reliability. She understood that the ranch ran with a minimum of wasted effort, that every system had been thought through by someone who valued practicality over convention, and that the someone was Caleb Boone, who was present in the shape of everything here the way a good carpenter is present in a well-made joint. She also understood with the slightly startled recognition of someone finding an unexpected object in a familiar pocket that she had not felt lonely since she had arrived. This was notable because she had been lonely for quite a while. Not devastatingly, not in a way she permitted herself to dwell on, but in the background way of someone whose daily life is structured entirely around solitary work in a confined space, a low, persistent hum of absence that she had become so accustomed to that she had stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing a sound that has always been there. She noticed it now because it was gone, replaced by something else, the presence of people, the particular warmth of a working household, the sounds of life being actively lived rather than carefully managed. She filed this observation in the same drawer as his comment about honest food, and she did not examine it directly, but she was aware of it. The evenings when the day's work was done and the cowhands had retreated to the bunkhouse with their cards and their conversation settled into a pattern that she had not designed and would not have predicted. Caleb did his ledgers at the kitchen table after supper, and she worked on the coats in the same space by the light of the same lamp, and the silence between them was not the uncomfortable silence of 2 people with nothing to say, but the functional silence of 2 people whose interior lives are sufficiently occupied that they have no need to fill the air with words. He asked her questions occasionally. About her work, about the choices she made in the construction of the coats, about why she had chosen a particular stitch for a particular seam. The questions were genuine. She could tell motivated by actual curiosity about a craft he had employed but not previously understood, and she answered them with the same straightforwardness she brought to everything, explaining the reasoning behind each decision, the relationship between the stitch pattern and the stress the garment would experience, the way the cut of a sleeve could either accommodate or resist the movement of the body inside it. He listened the way he looked at her work with full attention, without the performance of interest that some people substitute for the real thing. One evening, the 4th one, when the rain was still coming down outside and the fire in the kitchen stove had settled into a steady, sustaining warmth, she made a remark that she had not fully intended to make out loud. She had been working on the last coat, the one for Roy, which required the most careful attention to the asymmetry of his shoulders, and she had been fitting the right shoulder piece for the 3rd time, holding it up against her own shoulder for reference. In the absence of the man himself. And she said half to herself, "If I had your proportions instead of mine, this would be simpler." The remark was self-deprecating in the way of someone who has been trained to apologize for the space they occupy, a reflex so ingrained it operated sometimes without her permission. The room was quiet for a moment. She did not look up, and then Caleb set down his pen. She looked up because the sound of a pen being set down deliberately carries a different weight than a pen being set down casually, and she found him looking at her with an intensity she had not seen on his face before, a directness that was still somehow different from his ordinary directness. Something underneath it that had not been there in the professional transactions of the previous weeks. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and his voice was low and deliberate and entirely serious. "Those shoulders carried your dignity through the darkest days of your life." She held very still. "A woman who can stand on her own 2 feet," he said, "is not a woman who needs to apologize for the shape of the body that holds her up." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the rain had softened to a steady whisper against the roof, and the fire in the stove made its small regular sounds. And the lamp on the table burned between them with a warm and particular light. Clara Whitmore had spent 26 years receiving assessments of her physical presence from other people. She had received them in the form of her mother's public humiliation and her mother's private sighing, and the careful way certain women in town positioned their eyes when she walked by, and the manner in which certain men did not look at her at all. She had made her peace with all of it, or she had built her walls high enough that the peace and the walls were functionally indistinguishable, which was close enough. She had not until this moment received an assessment like this one. She looked at Caleb Boone across the lamplit kitchen table of Dry Creek Ranch, and she felt something move in her chest that she had no comfortable name for, something that was partly gratitude and partly grief, and partly a complicated, cautious, uncertain thing that she was not yet ready to call by any name at all, because naming it would make it real, and real things could be lost. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steady. She was, after all, a woman who had stood in the freezing rain and held her line tight. He looked at her for another moment, and then he picked up his pen and went back to his ledgers, and she went back to Roy's coat. And the rain came down outside with its quiet persistence, and neither of them said anything more about it. But something had shifted, the way a key turning in a lock shifts something, the mechanism moving into alignment with a small definitive sound that is barely audible and entirely irreversible. She finished the last coat 2 days later, on a morning when the rain had finally exhausted itself and the sky had cleared to a pale, tentative blue that promised nothing but at least had stopped threatening. She pressed and folded all 6 coats and arranged them on the kitchen table, and she called the men in from the yard and fitted each one, making the small final adjustments that are always necessary when a garment moves from the maker's hands to the body it was built for. Roy put his coat on and moved his right shoulder experimentally. The rope-throwing motion and the coat moved with him without resistance, and he looked at it, and then at her, and said, "Miss Clara, I've been wearing ranch coats for 30 years, and not one of them ever fit right at this shoulder." He shook his head slowly. "This is something else." The name caught her. Miss Clara, not Miss Whitmore. It had come naturally, without calculation, the way names do when they arrive from genuine feeling rather than social form. She looked at the assembled men in their new coats and felt beneath the professional satisfaction something warmer and less easily categorized. These were rough men, practical men who had no particular reason to care about a seamstress from the edge of town. And they were looking at her with the straightforward respect that working people extend to other working people who have done something well and real. "They'll holes," she said. "They'd better," Petey said with a grin that took 10 years off his already young face, "because my last coat fell apart in February, and I spent 6 weeks telling Roy I wasn't cold." Roy looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man who has heard a great deal in his life and expects to hear a great deal more. She laughed. It surprised her, the laugh the way genuine things sometimes surprise you by arriving without announcement, and she heard it in the kitchen of Dry Creek Ranch and thought, "I cannot remember the last time I laughed like that." The road to town had cleared enough to pass by mid-morning. She packed her bag and calculated her accounts with the precision that was as natural to her as breathing, tallying the cost of 5 nights of board and meals against the labor she had performed, and noting the final figure in her book. She would present it to Caleb and deduct it from the coat payment as they had agreed. She found him in the yard near the barn, looking at the water still running in the wheel ruts of the road with the assessing gaze of someone deciding whether a path is safe yet. He turned when he heard her. "Road's clear enough?" she said. "Mostly?" He agreed. She held out her account book, open to the relevant page. "Board and meals, 5 nights. Deducted from the coat total. The remainder is what you owe me." He looked at the figures. He was quiet for a moment. "Miss Whitmore," he said in the tone that meant he was about to say something he had considered. "The terms were agreed. she said calmly before he could continue. "I'll collect the remainder when you're able." Another moment of quiet, and then he looked at her with those creek-water eyes and said, "I'll have it to you by Friday." "Thank you," she said. She collected her bag from the kitchen and said goodbye to Roy, who was nearest the gate, and walked down the cleared road toward town with the particular quality of step that belongs to a woman who has done honest work and is returning to more of it, her bag over her shoulder and her account book in her pocket, and the pale November sun on her face. She did not look back, but she was aware with a precision she could not have measured but could not deny that he stood and watched her go. She was back at her shack by early afternoon, and the first thing she did was stoke the stove and put water on for tea, and the second thing she did was sit down at her cutting table and open her order book and look at what was waiting for her, because work was the surest medicine she knew for the particular unsettled quality of her interior weather. And her interior weather since leaving Dry Creek Ranch that morning had been unsettled in a way she was disinclined to examine. Too closely. The Henderson boys' hems were still waiting. Old Mr. Hargreave had left a note tucked under her door asking if she could manage a new collar for his Sunday coat before the month was out. Gus had sent word through his boarding-house neighbor that he had a friend at the mine who needed a full set of canvas work pants made to measure. She tallied the work and allocated it across the days available, and found with the usual combination of relief and determination that she was busy. Properly, genuinely busy. Not surviving-level busy, which was what she had been for the first weeks, but actually building something busy, which was a different thing, entirely, a thing that required more of her and gave more back. She collected the Henderson trousers from the hook where she had hung them on her way out 5 days ago and settled into the rhythm of the hem work, which was straightforward enough to allow a portion of her mind to run free, and the portion that ran free went, despite her intentions, directly back to Dry Creek Ranch. She was not a woman given to romantic sentiment. She had observed in the lives of women around her the way sentiment of that particular variety had a tendency to function as a solvent dissolving the edges of a person's self-determination in ways that were not always visible until significant structural damage had already occurred. She had also observed that the women most enthusiastically encouraged toward such sentiment were rarely the ones who benefited from it, and she had filed this observation early and kept it close. What she felt about Caleb Boone she therefore refused to classify as romantic sentiment, partly on principle, and partly because she genuinely did not yet have enough information to support that classification with any confidence. What she had was a collection of observable facts, and she arranged them in her mind with the same care she arranged her materials. He had looked at her directly from the first day. He had paid in advance without negotiation. He had, during a midnight storm, told her to hold her line tight rather than taking the problem from her hands. He had proposed a fair trade for an evening's help and not called it anything other than what it was. He had listened to her talk about stitching patterns with the full attention of someone for whom the subject had genuine interest. He had, in a low and deliberate voice by a kitchen fire, said something to her that she had turned over in her mind approximately 40 times since he had said it, and that showed no signs of wearing smooth. These were facts. She arranged them in a row, and looked at them and drew no conclusions, because she was a woman who understood that a collection of favorable facts was not the same thing as a trustworthy situation, and trustworthiness was the only currency she was currently in a position to invest in. She finished the Henderson hems by evening and moved on to Hargreaves' collar, and by the time the candle had burned a third of the way down, she had the pieces cut and the first seams basted, and she permitted herself to stop for the night. Caleb's payment arrived on Friday, exactly as he had said delivered, by the same ranch hand who had come for the tarps, along with a note, in a handwriting that was spare and direct, the handwriting of a man who writes what he means, and not more, good work. The men have not stopped talking about the coats. C. Boone. She read the note twice and put it in the box where she kept her business correspondence, and did not read it a third time, which she considered a reasonable exercise of discipline. December came, and with it the first real freeze, and the work continued to accumulate in the satisfying way of a business that is genuinely beginning to establish itself. Word had spread through the mining camps and the ranch operations west of town, with the organic efficiency of working communities where practical information moves quickly, and Clara found herself with some regularity opening her door to men she had not seen before, who had heard from someone who had heard from someone that the Whitmore seamstress did honest work at honest prices. She turned none of them away if she could fulfill the work within a reasonable time. And she was honest about her timeline when she could not, and she took on no job she could not do well, and she charged what the work was worth and accepted no less. She was building something. She could feel it the way you feel a structure taking shape beneath your hands. The weight of it becoming real, the proportions becoming clear, and the feeling was one of the most sustaining things she had experienced in her adult life. Caleb came again in the second week of December, unannounced in the early afternoon, when the light was clear and cold, and the creek behind the shack had begun to ice at the edges. She heard his horse and looked out the window and felt something move in her chest that she chose to identify as the professional attentiveness appropriate to the arrival of a good client. And she set down her work and went to the door. He had a new collection of items, smaller this time, a torn saddlebag that needed reinforcement, 2 pair of leather riding gloves with split seams at the fingers, and what appeared to be a child's coat, small and dark and damaged at the left sleeve, where something had pulled the seam apart with considerable force. She looked at the child's coat. "Neighbor's boy," he said, reading her question before she asked it. "His family is east of the creek. The boy got his sleeve caught in a fence gate. Coat's the only one he has." She took it from him and examined the damage, which was significant but not beyond repair. The sleeve would need to be reset rather than simply restitched, which was a more complex job than it appeared from the outside, but it was manageable. "I can have this done by tomorrow morning," she said. "The saddlebag and gloves are no rush," he said. "The coat is." She nodded and set the coat aside in the position she reserved for priority work. He paid for all 3 items in his usual manner in advance, without negotiating, and turned to go, and then turned back, which was not his usual manner. "There's a hard freeze coming tonight," he said. "The men are saying tomorrow or the day after at the latest." He looked at her shack with the assessing gaze of a man who builds and maintains structures for a living. "Your roof held through the November storm. How's the north wall?" She followed his gaze to the north wall, which she had patched more than once, and which was, she knew, the weakest point in her defenses against serious cold. "It holds," she said. He looked at her, and she recognized the look, the slight pause before a thought that he was deciding whether to voice, and she recognized in herself the slight stiffening that was her body's anticipatory response to the possibility of an offer of charity. "I have a load of split firewood at the ranch that I ordered cut for the bunkhouse, and got too much of," he said. "It's taking up space in the woodshed, and Roy's complaining about it. I could have a quarter cord dropped here in the morning if you're willing to take it off my hands." Clara looked at him steadily. "What would you want for it?" she asked. "A favor I can name later," he said without hesitation, which surprised her because it was not the form she had expected. "What kind of favor?" "The kind a man can call on when he needs good work done fast and without a lot of notice," he said. "I'll name it when I need it." She considered this. It was not charity. It was, in fact, a rather clever construction, a transaction with deferred terms which meant she would owe something real and would eventually pay it, and the balance of obligation would remain clear. She could see the architecture of it, and she could see that he had thought about it carefully, which meant he understood, at least in part, the nature of her objection to the alternatives. "Fair enough," she said. The firewood arrived the next morning stacked by a ranch hand against the north wall of the shack, where it had the additional effect of providing a layer of insulation against the wind. The freeze came that night exactly as predicted, and her fire burned steady and strong, and the shack held its warmth in a way that it had not managed in November, and she lay in her bed in the clean, cold dark, and felt something that was uncomplicatedly, straightforwardly grateful, and allowed herself to feel it without turning it into anything more complicated than what it was. She finished the neighbor boy's coat that morning, resetting the sleeve with a reinforced seam that would, she thought, outlast the coat itself, and she sent it back to the ranch with a note for Caleb to pass along to the family. She charged only for materials and a portion of her time less than she normally would have because it was a child's coat, and the family she gathered could not easily afford to replace it, and this was not charity. She told herself firmly, this was pricing, and a seamstress was entitled to set her own prices, and she set this one where she chose to set it, and that was her prerogative and nobody else's business. She wondered briefly whether Caleb had paid the difference without telling her. She dismissed the thought. She had no evidence for it, and she refused to borrow trouble from a future that might not exist. December continued, and with it the quiet accumulation of small things. Caleb came by twice more before Christmas, each time with work, and each time lingering for some minutes after the transaction was complete, not in the manner of a man without purpose, but in the manner of a man who has decided that a few minutes of additional presence is something he intends to allow himself. They talked in those minutes with the particular ease of two people who have established that they communicate in a similar register, direct and unhurried, and without the social padding that most conversation requires. He told her about the ranch, about a problem with one of the well casings that had required an unexpected repair, about a dispute between two neighboring ranchers over a fence line that he had been asked to mediate and had declined. She told him about the Henderson boys, all three of whom were growing in what she described as an unreasonable and poorly coordinated fashion, and about a commission she had taken from a woman in town who wanted a proper day dress made and who had very specific ideas about the cut of the sleeves that were, in Clara's professional assessment, structurally unsound. He laughed at the sleeve comment, a genuine laugh, quiet and without performance, and she noticed the way it changed his face, which was ordinarily a face of considerable containment, and she filed the observation in the drawer that was now decidedly full and which she was trying not to open too frequently. Christmas came and went. She spent it working, which was her choice, and required no defense. The town had its celebrations, and she was aware of them at a comfortable distance, the church bells and the smell of wood smoke, and the occasional sound of music from the direction of the assembly hall. And she sat by her stove and did Hargreaves' new cuffs, and felt the season in the particular way of someone who is self-sufficient enough to be at peace with their own company without necessarily being entirely at peace with solitude. January brought a new client she had not anticipated. A ranching family from the north of the valley, the Aldermans arrived on a Tuesday morning with a problem that turned out to be the most complex commission she had taken to date. They needed a complete overhaul of their working wardrobe, 8 people's worth, 4 adults and 4 children, everything assessed and repaired or replaced as needed, and they needed it done in 3 weeks because the spring drive preparations would begin in February, and they needed their people outfitted before then. She looked at the pile of clothing they had brought, assessed it, made her notes, named her price, and took the job. It was more work than she could manage in 3 weeks at her current pace, which meant she would need to extend her hours, which she was prepared to do, and it meant she would need to prioritize her current clients, which she managed by communicating honestly with each of them about her timeline, and all of them, to her satisfaction, responded with the practical flexibility of people who respect a person with too much work to do because they have been that person themselves. She realized, in the second week of January, in the middle of the Alderman Commission, no longer surviving. She was, by any honest accounting, doing well. Not prosperously well, not yet. Not in the way that involved a savings account at the Millhaven Bank and a stove that didn't require daily attention to its temperamental damper, but genuinely, structurally, sustainably well. Her books balanced. Her clients returned. She had begun with characteristic caution to think about what an expanded workspace might look like, whether the old barn at the edge of the creek property could be made habitable as a proper workshop, what that would cost, and over what timeline it could be achieved. She was thinking about this, running the numbers in her mind, while her hands ran a long seam on the oldest alderman boy's work coat when Caleb came by on a Thursday afternoon in the third week of January with something different in his manner that she noticed before he said a word. He came in and sat in the second chair, which had become over the months implicitly his when he visited, and he turned his hat in his hands in a way she had not seen him do before, a small circular motion that was the only visible evidence of some interior working. "I'm calling in my favor," he said. She set down her work and gave him her attention. "I need a seamstress at the ranch for 2 weeks in February," he said. "Full outfitting for the spring drive. I've got 12 men this season, and they all need gear assessed, and a lot of it replaced before we push the cattle north." He looked at her directly. "It's a bigger job than November, and I know February is when you'll have other work." "I do," she said. "I'll pay above your standard rate for the inconvenience of the timing," he said, "and the board arrangement will be the same as before, deducted from the final payment." She noted that he had structured it that way without being asked the board as a deduction, not a gift. He had remembered. She absorbed this without comment. "Let me look at my order book," she said, and she did, going through it with the careful attention it deserved, weighing her commitments against the reality of the timeline, and she found that with some renegotiation of delivery dates, which she thought her established clients would accommodate, given sufficient notice and honest explanation, she could make February at Dry Creek work. "I can do it," she said, "provided my current clients agree to adjusted timelines, which I'll confirm before I commit." "Of course," he said. She confirmed within 3 days. Gus said February was fine. The aldermans were finished and happy. Hargreaves said he could wait until March for the new cuffs, because his old ones weren't cold yet. She wrote to Caleb with her confirmation and her arrival date, and the materials list she would need him to have ready, and she put the letter with the ranch hand, who came by on his regular rounds, and the thing was settled. She arrived at Dry Creek Ranch on the 1st of February on a morning that was cold and clear, and still the kind of stillness that feels like the world holding its breath before something. And she was met in the yard by Roy, who took her bag with the matter-of-fact courtesy of someone who has decided that this is what you do when Miss Clara arrives at the ranch, and by Petey, who said, "The new men are nervous about the coat measurements," with a grin that suggested he had been actively cultivating their nervousness. The new men there were 5 of them hired on for the spring drive in addition to the original 6, ranged from a taciturn man of perhaps 50, who introduced himself only as Webb, and who had, she estimated, approximately 0 feelings about being measured, to a young man from somewhere south, who spoke with an accent she couldn't quite place, and who blushed to his hairline when she produced her measurement tape, which she managed with the professional briskness of someone who has been managing exactly this situation for months. She fell back into the rhythm of Dry Creek as easily as pulling on a familiar coat, with the slight surprise of comfort that comes from discovering a place has continued to feel like itself in your absence. The kitchen stove was the same. The lamp on the table was the same. The sounds of the ranch in the morning, the horses, the low voices, the creak of the big barn door, were the same. What was different, or what she permitted herself to notice was different, was the quality of the evenings. The kitchen table in February had the same lamp and the same stove and the same pattern of Caleb working his ledgers while she worked her materials. But there was something in the room that November had not had, something that had accumulated in the months between, in the visits to the shack and the conversations in the doorway and the note about the coats and the firewood arranged along the north wall. Something that neither of them named and neither of them acted upon, and both of them, she was increasingly certain, were aware of. He asked her one evening in the second week about her plans. Not in the intrusive way of someone assessing her prospects, but in the genuine way of someone who is interested in where a person intends to go. The barn by the creek, she said, because she had been thinking about it, and she had reached the point where she could say it out loud without it feeling like tempting fate. If I can make the numbers work by summer, I'd like to convert it into a proper workshop. More space, better light room for a second table. He was quiet for a moment, looking at his ledger. You'd need help with the structural work, he said. Some of those old barns have rot in the crossbeams. I know, she said. I'll assess it in the spring. He nodded. He did not offer to send his men. He did not suggest that he could help. He noted the fact and left it where it was, and she was grateful for that, for the restraint of a man who understood that some plans belong entirely to the person who is making them. The spring drive preparations advanced through the second week of February with the focused momentum of 12 men getting ready to move a substantial number of cattle over a substantial distance, and Clara worked alongside it all with the concentration the commission required, and the coats and the patched gear accumulated in satisfying stacks, and the men, all 12 of them by the end, called her Miss Clara, in the way that Roy had started it, as a matter of course, as a designation that had arrived organically and stuck because it fit. On the last evening of her stay, when the work was nearly complete and she was finishing the final alterations on Webb's coat, the quiet and compact garment of a man who had not bothered to tell her his requirements because he trusted she had figured them out, which she had, Caleb closed his ledger and looked at her across the table. "You've built something real," he said. She kept her eyes on her stitching for a moment. Then she looked up. "I have," she said. There was no false modesty in it, and no pride in the showy sense. Just the simple acknowledgment of a fact she had worked for. He looked at her with the full weight of that Autumn Creek gaze, and there was something in it she had not seen before, or had not permitted herself to see before, something that was not the professional regard of a satisfied client, and was not the neighborly warmth of a man who respected her competence. It was something more direct than either of those things, and more serious, and it sat between them in the lamplight with the same quiet weight as everything else that had accumulated in the months since a midnight storm, and a rope, and a voice shouting over the wind, "Hold your line tight, I've got this end." She looked back at him for 3 full seconds, which was longer than she would have allowed herself a month ago, and then she returned her eyes to her stitching, because she was not yet finished with Webb's coat, and she did not leave work undone, and because the thing between them was a thing that needed time, the right kind of time, and she was a woman who understood that some seams required careful preparation before the final stitch could be set. But she felt in the warmth of that kitchen on the last evening of February the way a person feels at the beginning of something. Not the breathless, untethered feeling of sentiment she had always been cautious of, but something sturdier than that, something built on the same foundation as everything else she had constructed in the last month's honest workfare terms, the hard-won knowledge that she could stand on her own 2 feet. And on those feet perhaps she could choose to stand beside someone. She finished Webb's coat. She folded it and set it on the pile. She closed her work bag with the clasp that had been repaired twice and still worked, because she fixed what was broken and kept what was good. Outside, the February dark had settled over Dry Creek Ranch, and somewhere in the barn the horses shifted in their stalls, and the fire in the kitchen stove made its steady, faithful sounds, and she sat in the warm kitchen and felt for the first time in as long as she could remember that the life she was building had enough room in it for more than one. She left Dry Creek Ranch the next morning in the thin, clear light of a February dawn, her work bag over her shoulder and her account book balanced to the penny, and she walked the road back to town with the particular quality of step that had become over the months entirely her own. Not the careful, space-conserving walk of the woman who had crossed the assembly hall floor at the spring gala. Something else. Something that occupied the ground it stood on without apology. The remainder of February passed in the productive blur of a business operating at the edge of its capacity, which was exactly where Clara preferred to operate, because the edge was where the work was real, and the attention was full, and there was no surplus energy available for the kind of interior wandering that she had learned to distrust. She confirmed her arrangements with the aldermans for a spring commission, took on 2 new clients from the east side of the valley, and began in the evenings when the day's work was done, and the candle was burning low to sketch plans for the barn conversion with the careful, measured optimism of someone who has learned that hope is most useful when it comes with accurate dimensions. March arrived and softened the ground and brought the first tentative green to the cottonwoods along the creek, and Caleb came by on a Wednesday afternoon with a saddlebag of assorted repair work, and stayed for the conversation that had become by now as much a part of his visits as the work itself. He told her the spring drive had gone well, that they had pushed the cattle north ahead of schedule, that Roy had declared his coat the finest piece of clothing he had worn in 40 years of ranch work, which Clara received with the quiet satisfaction it deserved. She told him about the barn plans, spreading her sketched diagrams on the cutting table, and he looked at them with genuine attention and said, without offering to intervene, that the east-facing window placement would give her the best light for detailed work in the afternoon hours, which was both correct and the kind of observation that only someone who had watched her work would know to make. She looked at him when he said it, and he looked at the diagram, and neither of them made anything of the moment, and it settled into the accumulation of all the other moments between them with the same quiet weight. April came. And with April came the first real warmth and the barn assessment she had been planning since February, and the discovery that 2 of the crossbeams were sound and 3 needed replacing, and the calculation that the replacement cost, while significant, was within the range she could manage by midsummer, if the work held at its current pace. It was holding. She allowed herself to believe that it would continue to hold. She was in the barn on a Tuesday morning in late April, measuring the north wall for her planned shelving, when she heard a horse in the yard and looked out through the gap in the barn wall to see Caleb tying up at the post. She had not been expecting him. She finished her measurement, noted the number in her book, and went out to meet him. He had a small amount of work, a leather belt needing a new buckle, stitched, something he could have sent with the ranch hand on the regular rounds, and had not. And she noted this without remarking on it, and took the belt, and they stood in the mild April sun, and talked for a while about the barn, and he walked the perimeter of it with the assessing gaze of a man who understands structures, and he said the south wall was sounder than it looked, and the foundation stones were well placed, which were both things she had independently concluded, and she found a satisfaction in the confirmation that was distinct from, but related to the satisfaction of his presence. He left after an hour, and she went back inside and stood at her cutting table, and looked at nothing in particular for a moment. She understood by April that what she felt about Caleb Boone was not a collection of favorable facts in a carefully managed drawer. It was something alive and specific and rooted in 8 months of genuine evidence in the way he had looked at her from the first day, and never looked away in the way he had structured every transaction between them, with a fairness that was not performed, but intrinsic in the way he had said, by a kitchen fire, in November, the truest thing anyone had said to her in her adult life. She understood that it had the particular quality of a feeling that was not going to be managed away, no matter how many drawers she built for it. What she did not know, and what she refused to act on without knowing, was whether the feeling was shared in the way that would make it something other than a private experience. She picked up the belt and began work on the buckle stitching, and let the question sit where it was. The answer, when it came, did not arrive in the form she might have imagined. It arrived in the form of a ledger, and a name written in familiar handwriting, and a morning in Caleb's office that she would mark afterward as the moment when the architecture of the last 8 months revealed a crack she had not seen from any of the angles she had been standing at. It was the last week of April, She had ridden out to Dry Creek with the completed spring drive gear for 2 of the newer hands who had been hired after her February visit and who needed outfitting before the second push, north in May. Caleb had been out in the north pasture when she arrived, and Roy had shown her to the office where she could leave the gear and wait, because Caleb had left word that he would be back within the hour. She set the gear on the long bench that ran along the office wall and looked at the room with the comfortable familiarity of someone who has been in a place enough times to have stopped really seeing it. The oak desk, the map on the wall with its penciled annotations, the row of ledgers on the shelf above the window, their spines labeled by year in Caleb's spare handwriting. She was not snooping. She would be clear about this afterward in the accounting she gave herself and in the one she gave him. She was not snooping. She was standing near the desk, waiting for a man who had asked her to wait, and the ledger was open on the desk because he had been working in it that morning before he rode out, and when she accidentally caught the edge of it with her elbow in the process of setting her work bag down, it fell from its half-open position to fully open, and she reached to straighten it, and she saw the page it had fallen open to, and she saw the date at the top of the page, which was in the first week of December, the first month she had been in the shack, and she saw the column of names. She recognized the names. She recognized them because they were the names of her earliest clients. Gus, who had been first with his split canvas trousers, Martin and Pete from the mine, Old Sullivan from the boarding house, Anders, the freight driver, who had needed his winter coat relined. The names ran down the column in careful order, and beside each name was a figure, and beside each figure was a notation. She read the notation beside Gus's name first, because it was at the top of the column, and her eyes went there naturally, and then she read it again, because the first reading had not fully resolved into meaning, and then the meaning arrived in its entirety, and she stood very still. The notation read, "Advanced for mending work at Whitmore. Prepay her rate. Tell him not to mention it." She looked at the next name, Martin. The same notation, different amount. Tell him not to mention it. Pete. Same. Sullivan. Same. Anders. Same. She stood in Caleb's office with the open ledger in front of her, and she read down the column and counted 5 names and 5 figures and 5 notations that all said the same thing in their different amounts, and she felt the ground shift beneath her feet in a way that was not dramatic. Not the sudden lurch of a physical loss of balance, but the slow, awful tilt of a world that is rearranging itself around a new piece of information that changes the meaning of everything that came before it. She stood there for a long time. She was not certain how long. Long enough for the meaning to complete its work, for the full architecture of those first weeks to reassemble itself in her mind with this new information built into it, and what it looked like when reassembled was not what it had looked like before. Those first clients had not found her sign because word had traveled through the natural channels of working men's communities. Or not entirely. Some of them had been sent to her. Some of them had been given the money to pay her beforehand and told not to say where it came from. Some of the foundation of what she had built the first weeks of it, the weeks she had told herself were proof that honest work for honest pay was enough, that she could do this on her own, that the world would meet competence. With fair compensation if you simply held your line. Some of that foundation had been quietly installed beneath her by a man who had decided without her knowledge and without her consent that she needed help. She thought about the first time Gus had come to the door, the way he had stood with his hat in his hands and his bad trousers folded under his arm, the way she had held firm on her price, the way she had felt when he paid it without further argument, the clean and bracing satisfaction of a fair transaction. She thought about what that satisfaction had been built on. She set the ledger back on the desk carefully in the position it had been in before she had touched it. She straightened the page. She stood up and looked at the room and took a slow breath, and then another one, and she felt the particular cold clarity that comes to her in moments that require it, the clarity that had carried her across the assembly hall and down the dark road to the shack and through every difficult morning since. She was not going to cry. She was not going to panic. She was going to wait for Caleb Boone to return from his north pasture. And she was going to have a conversation with him, and she was going to do it with the same composure that she brought to every hard thing, because composure was not coldness. It was the form that her particular variety of strength took under pressure, and she was not going to apologize for it. She waited. She stood by the window and watched the yard, and she arranged her thoughts with the methodical care of someone preparing a case, because that was what this was, and she intended to make it clearly. He came back 40 minutes later, riding across the yard at the unhurried pace of a man returning from routine work, and he saw her at the window, and she saw the small change in his posture that meant he had registered something in the quality of her stillness, because he was a man who paid attention, which she had always valued about him, and which was, she thought, with a flat and painful precision, exactly the quality that had allowed him to observe her situation clearly enough in those first weeks to decide that it required his intervention. He came into the office and looked at her, and she looked at him, and she said, "Close the door, please." He closed the door. He did not sit. He stood in the center of the room with his hat in his hand and his creek water eyes on her face, and she saw on his face that he already knew, or suspected, or had always known this moment might come, because there was no performance of innocence there, just a steady, serious attention. She pointed to the ledger on the desk. "I knocked it," she said. "It fell open. I saw the page from December." He looked at the ledger and then at her. He said nothing. "5 names," she said. 5 men you paid before they came to me. 5 men you told not to mention it." The office was very quiet. Outside, the sounds of the ranch continued in their ordinary way, entirely indifferent to the fact that inside this room something was breaking. "Why?" she said. The question was not loud, and it was not shaking. It was simply direct, the way everything she said was direct. Because she was not a woman who asked questions she did not actually want answered. He looked at her for a moment before he spoke, and when he spoke, it was in the low, careful voice of a man who is not going to lie and knows what the truth is going to cost. "You were in that shack at the start of December with 3 weeks' worth of work and a roof that had just come through a major storm," he said. "It was below freezing. You had turned down 2 offers of food that I knew of. You were holding to a principle that would have kept you honest and hungry all winter." "That was my choice to make," she said. "Yes," he said, "it was. You made it for me." He did not look away. "I gave some men money and told them you were the best mending work in the valley," he said. "That part was true, and the rest of it was a lie," she said. "Not in its words, maybe, but in what it was. You constructed something and called it my success, and it was built at the start on your money." She stopped and took one careful breath. "My mother insulted my body in front of every soul in Millhaven, and it hurt, because bodies can be survived. But you took the only thing I had built that was entirely mine, and you made it partly yours without telling me. You made me your dependent without my consent." The word landed in the room and stayed there. She saw something move across his face. Not defensiveness, she had braced for defensiveness, and it would have been easier in some ways, but something more complicated and more painful, to look at the expression of a man who is hearing a true thing and recognizing it as true. "I thought I was helping," he said. "I know you did," she said. "That is almost the hardest part. You looked at me, and you saw someone who needed to be helped, and you helped me the way a person helps someone who cannot help themselves. And I have spent 8 months believing that I proved I could stand on my own, and you knew the whole time that the ground I was standing on was not entirely mine." She moved to the desk and picked up her work bag. She set it on the surface of the desk and opened it and took out her account book, and she opened it to the page she needed and looked at it with the clear-eyed attention of someone performing a calculation that matters. She was not going to leave in disarray. She was not going to storm out and leave accounts unsettled and the transaction incomplete, because that was not how she did things, and she was not going to become someone different because she was angry. She was, if anything, most completely herself in this moment, and she intended to be exactly herself. She tallied the cost of her board for the previous 2 stays at the ranch. She totaled the labor she had performed on both occasions against the payment she had received, identified the amount she had deducted for board, verified her arithmetic twice, and then she reached into the inner pocket of her work bag where she kept her operating cash carefully folded and accounted for, and she counted out the precise amount that represented the difference between what she had received and what she would have received had she paid full market rate for her board rather than the discounted deduction they had agreed on. She had always suspected the discounted rate was below what a comparable room and board would cost in town. She had accepted it because it was the rate he had named, and she had verified it was not charity, but had not verified it was fully accurate. She was verifying it now in the other direction, paying the gap out of her own pocket, because she would not leave this room with any balance unaccounted for. She placed the money on his desk. The coins made a small, clear sound in the silence. "This covers the remaining balance on the board from February," she said. The November stay was included in the TARP arrangement, which was a fair trade. February was not part of any prior arrangement, and I did not verify the rate with sufficient care. That is my error, and I am correcting it. He looked at the money on his desk and then at her. "Clara," he said. And it was the first time he had used her name without the title, and she heard it land somewhere in her chest with a precision that made her press her lips together for a moment before she continued. "I would like to know," she said with careful evenness, "how much you advanced in total to the 5 men in December." He told her. The number was not large by his standards, she suspected. By the standards of the first weeks in the shack, it was substantial. She wrote it in her account book on a fresh page. "I will repay it," she said, "in full. I will need to know how you would like it structured." "Clara, I don't want the money." "I know," she said. "That is not the point. The point is that I will repay it because it is a debt, and I do not carry debts I do not know about, and now I know about it." She closed the account book and put it in her bag. "I will send you a schedule when I have worked out the timing." She picked up her bag, and she looked at him one last time, and she saw on his face the fullness of what this moment was costing him, and she felt the fullness of what it was costing her, and she thought that if it were a simpler story, a less true story, she might have been moved by the expression on his face to set the bag down and stay. But she was Clara Whitmore, and she had learned in 8 months of building something entirely her own that the structure of a thing mattered as much as the warmth of it, that a foundation built without your knowledge was still a foundation you had not laid with your own hands, and that the difference was not small. She walked to the office door. She put her hand on the latch. "You told me," she said without turning around, "that those shoulders carried my dignity through the darkest days of my life." She paused. "I believed you. I still believe you. But dignity cannot be built on someone else's ground, Caleb, not even someone else's well-intentioned ground." She opened the door. "I hope you understand that someday." She walked through the door and across the yard and down the road away from Dry Creek Ranch, and the April sun was warm on her face, and the cottonwoods along the creek were green with their new leaves, and she did not look back, and her step on the road was exactly what it had always been. the step of a woman who occupies the ground she stands on without apology, because it is hers, because she built it, because she earned every inch of it with her own 2 hands. The road stretched ahead of her toward Millhaven, and she walked it with her head up and her work bag over her shoulder, and somewhere behind her, in an oak-paneled office with a ledger open on the desk and a small pile of coins that nobody wanted returned. Caleb Boone stood at the window and watched her go, and this time she did not have the sense of his eyes on her back with warmth. She had the sense of a man being asked for the first time in his life to understand something that his particular variety of decency had not previously required him to understand, and she did not know whether he was capable of understanding it, and she could not make him capable of it, and she would not wait in hope of it. She could only walk her own road. She did. The town came into view around the long bend where the cottonwoods thinned and the valley opened, and she walked into it with the same composure she had walked out of it months ago on a cold November night in a lavender dress that had never fit her right. She was, she thought, considerably better dressed now. She was back at the shack by late afternoon, and she did not sit down when she got there. Sitting felt wrong, felt like an invitation to the kind of interior unraveling she had no intention of permitting. So she stood at her cutting table and she worked because work was what she had, and work was what had always been enough, and she was going to need it to be enough again now. She took out the alderman commission pieces that were waiting for their final fittings, and she set them in order on the table. And she looked at them with the focused attention of a woman who intends to be entirely present in her work, and for a while she succeeded. The stitching was precise. The seams were true. She worked for 2 hours without stopping, and the quality of what came off her table in those 2 hours was as good as anything she had ever made, which told her something about the relationship between grief and precision in her particular constitution, which was that grief for her did not soften the hands, but steadied them. She stopped when the candle had burned low, and the light was no longer adequate for detail work, and she sat on the edge of her bed, and she permitted herself, in the privacy of the shack and the dark, to feel the full weight of the day. It was heavier than she had let herself acknowledge on the road home. The walk had required a particular kind of composure, and she had maintained it, and now that the composure was no longer required, she sat with what was underneath it, and what was underneath it was not simple anger. Anger would have been cleaner. What she felt, or refelt, was more complicated than anger, a compound thing made of several true elements that did not resolve into each other neatly. There was the anger, yes, real and legitimate, at the removal of her consent from a decision that had directly shaped her life. There was the grief of it, the particular grief of a thing believed to be entirely yours, turning out to be partly someone else's, the way a painting you thought you had made alone turns out to have had another hand in it, and even if the other hand was well-intentioned, even if it had made the painting better, the fact of its presence changes what the painting means. There was also underneath both of those things something she was less willing to look at, the ache of what she had walked away from. Not just the professional arrangement, not just the comfortable rhythm of a relationship that had been building for 8 months toward something she had not yet named, but had begun in the warmth of February kitchens and April conversations to allow herself to imagine. She had not imagined small things. She was not a woman who, when she allowed herself to imagine, imagined small. She set that aside. She set all of it aside with the practiced efficiency of a woman who understands that feelings like difficult mending jobs do not go away when you put them down, but they are easier to manage when you can pick them up on your own terms. She made her repayment schedule that night by candlelight with the clear-eyed arithmetic that was her strongest available tool. She divided the figure Caleb had named into 6 equal installments, the first to be delivered within the month, and she looked at her order book and confirmed that 6 months of installments at that amount was manageable within her current income, without compromising her barn conversion timeline significantly, perhaps by 6 weeks at the outside. She wrote the schedule in her neatest hand on a clean page, made a copy, and addressed the copy to Dry Creek Ranch. She would send it with the next available rider. She slept eventually in the deep and dreamless way of a body that has been through something significant and needs the recovery time more than it needs the processing. She woke the next morning to the sound of the creek running fast with the spring melt, and she lay still for a moment and listened to it. And then she got up and stoked the stove and made her tea and opened her order book and began her day. This was what she had. This was what she had built. And it was real. Whatever else was also true, the realness of it had not been altered by the discovery of those 5 names in a December ledger. She had done the work. Every stitch after those first weeks had been laid by her own hand, with her own skill at her own rate. And the clients who came to her now came because of what they had heard from other clients, and the reputation she carried in the valley was hers in full, and nobody had arranged that. She held on to this, not as a consolation, but as a fact, and facts were what she built on. The days that followed had a quality of purposeful forward motion that she cultivated deliberately, choosing each morning to face the day's work with the same direct attention she had always given it, and choosing each evening not to sit in the absence that had opened in the space where the rhythm of Dry Creek and the lamplit kitchen table and the creek water eyes had been. She sent the repayment schedule. She received no reply which she had not expected and did not require. She began the barn conversion assessment in earnest, bringing in a carpenter named Stokes who charged a fair rate and talked to her about the work as though she were a person capable of understanding structural principles, which she was, and who confirmed her assessment of the crossbeams and gave her a timeline and a cost that matched closely with her own estimates. She authorized the work. It would begin in June. May moved through the valley with the generous, uncomplicated beauty of a season that has no interest in anyone's interior complications. The grasses green along the creek and the cottonwoods full, and the days long enough now that she could work by natural light until nearly 8 in the evening. She worked the long days with the focused productivity of someone who has converted grief into output, who has taken the energy that might have gone into other things and redirected it entirely into the construction of the life she had been building since November, and the result was visible in her order book and in the accumulating evidence of a business that was by any honest measure thriving. She was in the yard of the shack on a Saturday morning in the second week of May, taking measurements of the barn's south wall for the shelving layout, when she heard horses on the road and looked up and saw coming around the bend where the cottonwoods thinned her mother's buggy. It was the distinctive dark green of the Whitmore carriage, the one her father had bought in the prosperous years before his death, and it was driven by the family's hired man, and inside it, in the upright and precise posture of a woman who has never in her life slouched against a carriage seat, sat Adeline Whitmore. Beside her, with the particular expression of a woman who has decided that proximity to a socially embarrassing situation is preferable to the alternative of being thought to have abandoned ship, sat Margaret Pursley, who was Millhaven's preeminent collector and distributor of social information, and who had been in Clara's experience present at every significant unpleasant event in the town's recent history, with the reliability of a bad penny and the enthusiasm of a natural historian cataloging a rare specimen. The buggy stopped in the road, not pulling up to the yard, which was a distinction Clara noted with the same attention she gave to all positioning in a conversation, because where a person stands tells you what they intend to do with their feet. Adeline Whitmore had stopped in the road because she did not intend to come to the yard, which meant she expected Clara to come to the road, which was an expectation Clara had no particular intention of fulfilling. She set her measuring tape over her shoulder and walked to the fence, which was the midpoint, and she waited. Adeline looked at her from the buggy with the expression that Clara had spent 26 years cataloging in its various gradations, and this particular gradation was the one that combined social assessment with the specific pinched quality that meant she was preparing to say something she had decided in advance and intended to deliver as a finality. "I hear you've been thrown out by the Boone man," Adeline said. Margaret Pursley, beside her, arranged her face into an expression of sympathetic neutrality that fooled neither of them. Clara looked at her mother. She felt in this moment something she had not expected to feel, a quality of calm that was not the cold composure of the assembly hall or the controlled steadiness of Caleb's office, but something older and quieter than both of those things, the calm of a woman who has already survived the worst this particular source of pain can deliver and knows it. "I was not thrown out," Clara said. Her voice was even and clear in the morning air. "I walked away." "From what exactly?" what Adeline said. "The charity of a man who felt sorry for you." Clara looked at her mother for a long moment. She thought about the December ledger. She thought about the 5 names and the 5 figures and the 5 notations that said, "Tell him not to mention it." She thought about what her mother had just said, and she thought about the fact that her mother was not wrong, not entirely, that charity had been a part of it, that Caleb's intentions, however honest, had been the intentions of someone who had looked at her and seen need. And she thought about the distance between that and what her mother meant by it, which was that Clara's existence was fundamentally a charity case, that her survival was evidence of her inadequacy rather than her strength. She thought about every morning she had woken up in the cold shack and stoked the fire and sat down to work. She thought about Webb's coat and Roy's asymmetric shoulder, and Petey's vented back panel, and the Henderson boys' hems, and the Alderman commission, and the barn south wall that she was currently measuring for shelving. She looked at her mother, and she straightened to her full height, and she said, "I walked away from a complicated situation that I handled on my own terms, which is what I do. Everything you see here." She gestured to the yard, the shack, the barn, the measuring tape on her shoulder, the order book in her coat pocket. "I built. I built it with my hands and my skill, and my rates and my name. Nobody gave it to me. And I would rather be a broad-shouldered seamstress, standing on her own ground, earning clean money at honest work, than wear silk in a house where the only currency is someone else's approval." She paused, and she looked at her mother with the steadiness of someone who has nothing left to lose from this particular direction and has therefore discovered an unexpected freedom in it. "You taught me that a woman without beauty had nothing," she said. "I want to thank you for it, because it turned out to be wrong, and finding that out for myself the hard way, in a cold shack in November, is the most useful education I have ever received." Adeline Whitmore's face did a complicated sequence of things that Clara watched with the detached attention of someone observing weather. "So she net." Margaret Pursley, beside her, had the expression of a woman who came to witness a skirmish and has found herself at a rather more significant engagement than anticipated, and is reassessing her position. "You are an embarrassment," Adeline said, but the word had lost its architecture. Clara could hear it. It was a word that had been used as a weapon and had struck something it could no longer penetrate, and both of them knew it. "Good morning, Mother," Clara said. And she turned and walked back to the barn wall and picked up her measuring tape and resumed her work. Behind her, she heard the buggy move off down the road. She heard Margaret Pursley say something low and indistinct to Adeline, and she heard Adeline say nothing in return, which was in its way the most significant thing she had heard from her mother in a very long time. She finished her measurements. She went inside and wrote them in her book. She made tea and sat down to work and found that her hands were entirely steady. What she did not know, standing at her barn wall in the May morning with her measuring tape, was that she had had an audience she had not seen. The road that ran past her shack bent at the far eastern end behind a stand of cottonwoods before it straightened again into the track that led eventually toward the Dry Creek Road, and a man on horseback arriving from the direction of the ranch and intending to pull up at her fence had rounded that bend and seen the green Whitmore buggy stopped in the road and had halted his horse in the cover of the cottonwoods, not from cowardice, she would understand later, but from the instinct of a man who has learned to read situations quickly, and had read this one correctly, had understood that what was happening in the road in front of her shack was something that belonged entirely to Clara, and that the most respectful thing he could do was stay out of it. He had stayed out of it. He had sat on his horse in the cottonwood cover and watched, and he had heard what she said to her mother, and he had heard the steadiness of her voice and the precision of her words, and the way she had turned back to her work when the conversation was finished, as though the conversation were a thread that had needed cutting, and she had cut it cleanly, and now the work was there, and the work was what mattered. He had stayed in the cottonwoods for a long moment after the buggy had gone, and then he had ridden slowly to her fence and tied his horse and come to the barn where she was writing in her order book, and she had looked up and seen him standing in the barn doorway with his hat in his hand, and the quality of his stillness had been different from any of the previous stills she had catalogued in 8 months of careful observation. He looked like a man who has understood something. Not been told it and agreed to it as a social formality, but actually understood it the way you understand a structural principle when you have seen what happens to a building that ignores it. She looked at him and waited. "I heard what you said," he said. "I was in the cottonwoods. I had ridden out to talk to you, and I saw your mother's buggy, and I stayed back." He met her eyes without deflection. "I want you to know that I heard it, and I want you to know that everything you said was right." She held her order book and waited. "What I did in December was wrong," he said, and his voice had the quality of a man who has spent several weeks in the company of a hard truth and has finally arrived at the point of saying it plainly, without qualification and without defense. "Not in its intention, maybe, but in its effect. I looked at you and I saw need, and I addressed the need without asking whether the way I addressed it was something you would have chosen. I made a decision about your life that was yours to make, and I told myself it was help, and it was not help in the way that matters to you, which is the only way. Help means anything." The barn was quiet. Outside, the creek ran its steady spring course, and the cottonwoods moved slightly in the warm May air, and somewhere in the distance a meadowlark sang its 2-note call with the uncomplicated clarity of a thing that knows exactly what it is. "I know," Clara said. "I am not here to apologize and expect you to fall into my arms," he said, and there was something in the phrasing that was both careful and deliberate, as though he had thought about how to say this and had chosen the words with the attention he brought to everything. "I am here because I have a business proposition." She looked at him. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. He crossed the barn and set it on her cutting table, not handing it to her, setting it on the table where her work lived, where she would pick it up in her own time and read it in her own way. Then he stepped back. She looked at the document and then at him, and then she picked it up and unfolded it. It was a contract, a proper legal contract, the kind drawn up by a man who has a lawyer in Millhaven and has used him recently on good paper with careful language and a place at the bottom for signatures. She read it from the beginning the way she read everything that required her full attention without skipping to the end. It was a 3-year exclusive contract for all tailoring and outfitting work at Dry Creek Ranch, covering all permanent hands and seasonal workers, all canvas and leather, work all specialized gear requirements arising from the ranch's operations. The rate was specified per item category, and the rates were, she noted, with the professional attention she could not have suppressed, even in the most emotionally complex moment of her life, above her standard rate. Not extravagantly above, not in a way that smelled of charity, but above in the way that a premium is above a standard rate, when the client is purchasing reliability and exclusivity and the assurance that the work will be done to a known standard by a known hand. At the top of the contract, in the space where the party names were written, she read Dry Creek Ranch, represented by Caleb Boone, proprietor, and on the other line, the space that awaited her signature, a title had been written. Proprietor Whitmore. Not Miss Whitmore. Not Clara Whitmore, seamstress. Proprietor Whitmore. She read the contract to the end. She read the terms and the rates and the duration and the provisions for renewal, and she found them fair, found them more than fair, found them the work of a man who had thought carefully about what fair actually meant in this specific context and had built a structure that reflected that thinking. She set the contract on the table and looked at it for a moment. 20% up front, she said. Yes, he said. It is in the contract. I see it. She looked at him. You had this drawn up by Collins in town last week, he said. Before you knew I would be here today. Yes, he said. I was coming out here today regardless. I had been working up to it for 2 weeks. He looked at her with the creek water eyes, and what was in them now was not the contained professional regard of a client, and it was not the careful warmth of a man allowing himself something he had not previously permitted. It was something fuller than both of those, something that had arrived in him. She thought through the process of understanding the hard thing she had needed him to understand. I could not come to you with an apology and nothing else. That would have been asking you to do the work of deciding whether to forgive me and giving you nothing in return for it. That is not how I want to transact with you. She absorbed this. What you deserve, he said, and his voice was low and entirely serious, is a man who comes to you with something real, who treats you as the professional you are, who does not ask you to receive his apology as though it is a favor to you. He looked at the contract on her table. Sign it as Proprietor Whitmore. Take the 20%. Run your business on your terms, and let the work between us be what it has always been, the thing we are both actually good at. She looked at the contract. She looked at the title he had written in the place where her name would go. And the other thing, she said, because she was not a woman who pretended the other thing was not present in the room when it manifestly was. He held her gaze with the directness that had characterized every honest moment between them. Once you sign as my business partner, he said, I would like to ask as a separate matter entirely whether you would allow a man who has made a significant error and learned something genuinely difficult from it to court you properly. He paused, and in the pause she heard all the months of it, the ledger visits and the firewood and the evening conversations and the coat that fit, and the things said by the kitchen fire that she had turned over in her mind until it was smooth. On your terms, at your pace, with the full understanding that you do not need me and that the only reason for any of this is that I would very much like if you are willing to be in your life, not as a benefactor and not as a savior, as someone who admires you more than he has words for, and who would like the opportunity to prove he understands what that means. The barn held the quiet between them. The meadowlark called again from somewhere out along the creek, and the warm spring air moved through the open door, and the contract lay on the cutting table with its careful language and its upfront payment, and the title it had given her, Proprietor Whitmore, which was both a business designation and something else, something that named what she had made of herself since November, what she had built from a grandmother's sewing kit, and a drafty shack, and the iron-core decision that she would survive on honest terms, or she would not survive on anyone else's. She picked up her pen from the holder on the cutting table. She dipped it, and she looked at the contract, and she signed her name in the space provided, and she wrote the title before it with the clean satisfaction of a woman claiming what she has earned. Proprietor C. Whitmore. She set the pen down and looked at the signed contract, and then at Caleb Boone, who was standing in her barn with his hat in his hand, and all the carefully contained feeling of 8 months visible on his face, in a way she had not seen it visible before the face of a man who has been waiting for something and has arrived at last at the moment of knowing whether he was right to wait. "The contract is signed," she said. She pushed it across the table toward him. "You may keep the original. I will want a copy." "Of course," he said. He picked it up. "As for the other matter," she said, and she allowed herself for the first time the small thing she had been holding back for a very long time, a slight softening of her expression, not a performance of warmth, but the real thing visible now because she had chosen to let it be visible. "I believe you said courting, properly." "I did," he said. "Then I would suggest," she said, "that proper courting begins with showing up at a stated time on a stated day for a stated purpose, which is communicated in advance and agreed to by both parties." He looked at her, and the thing that happened to his face in that moment was worth all the months of careful observation she had invested in learning to read it. "Saturday," he said, 3:00. "I will bring no flowers because you are not a woman who needs decoration, and I will bring no apologies because they have been made and received and we are past them. I will bring myself and the intention to take a walk along the creek and talk to you without any agenda beyond the fact of your company." "Saturday at 3:00, she said. "I will be at the barn. I have measurements to finish." He nodded once with the economy of a man who has said what needed saying and trusts the other person to have heard it. He turned and walked out of the barn and across the yard to his horse, and she stood in the doorway of the barn. She was converting into the workshop that would carry her name, and she watched him go. And this time she let herself watch, let herself see the way he moved, the self-possession of him, the quality of a man entirely at home in the world he has built. And she thought that there was something fine in two people like that, finding each other, two people who had built their own worlds and were choosing from a position of genuine sufficiency to see whether those worlds might be built adjacent. Not because either of them needed the other, but because the choice made freely by people who could each stand on their own ground meant something that a choice made from need could never mean. He mounted his horse and turned in the yard, and he looked back at her once with those creek-water eyes in the May morning light, and she met the look with the full, steady, undefended attention of a woman who has decided that some things are worth being seen. Then he rode down the road, and she went back to her measurements. Saturday came with the particular clarity of a May afternoon that has decided to be exactly what a May afternoon should be, warm and light-filled and unhurried, the creek running bright along its banks and the cottonwoods making their green and silver conversation in the mild wind. She was at the barn at 3:00 because she was always exactly where she said she would be, at the time she said she would be there. And he arrived at 3:00 for the same reason, and they met in the yard between the shack and the barn with the natural ease of two people who have been finding their way to this moment for 8 months and have finally arrived without the weight of all the unfinished business that had been traveling with them. They walked along the creek for 2 hours, talking in the way they always talked, direct and unhurried, but differently too, with something that had been released between them, some formal structure that had held things at their appropriate professional distance, now set aside. Not all the way, not carelessly, but enough that when he said something that made her laugh, she laughed the way she had laughed in the Dry Creek kitchen in February, without announcement, without calculation, the laugh arriving because it was real. He told her about his father and the ranch in the early years, and the particular kind of loneliness that belongs to a man who has built a large and successful thing and finds that the success does not resolve the loneliness in the way he had expected it to. She told him about her grandmother, the one who had taught her to sew, a woman of formidable practical intelligence, who had believed, as Clara did, that useful knowledge was a form of dignity, and who had also believed, she said, that a person who could make things with their hands would never be entirely without power in any situation, which had turned out, in Clara's experience, to be true. He listened the way he always listened, which was with his whole attention, and she felt the particular quality of that attention which she had valued professionally for 8 months and was now receiving in a different register, entirely, not less careful, but more personal. The attention of a man directing his full regard at the specific person. She was not the seamstress, not the tough woman in the shack, but Clara, who had a grandmother she missed, and a laugh that arrived without warning, and broad shoulders that had carried more than he would ever fully know. When they came back to the yard in the long golden light of the late afternoon, he stopped at the gate and looked at her, and she looked at him, and there was nothing left between them that was unsaid or unresolved, nothing that needed to be managed or negotiated or settled. Just two people standing in the May light, having arrived by different and difficult roads at the same place. "Next Saturday," he said. "Next Saturday," she agreed. He rode away, and she stood at the gate and listened to the creek and the cottonwoods and the meadowlark that had apparently decided her yard was an acceptable venue for its evening repertoire. And she felt in the warmth of the fading afternoon the full and uncomplicated weight of a life that was entirely hers, that she had built on ground. She had broken herself with hands she had trusted when nothing else was trustworthy, and that had room in it now, chosen room, freely given room, for someone who had learned at some cost, to his own comfortable certainties, that the woman he admired did not need to be helped into her life, but could be accompanied through it. The barn conversion was completed in late June, 3 weeks ahead of Stokes's original estimate, because Clara had a talent for the efficient management of other people's work that surprised everyone except herself. She set up her cutting tables along the south wall, where the light was best in the afternoon, as Caleb had observed it would be, and she hung her patterns on the north wall and arranged her materials in the shelving along the east. And she stood in the center of her workshop on the first morning it was operational, and looked at the space around her and felt something that she did not try to name with precision, because it was too large for a single word and too real to require one. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was in the specific and irreducible sense hers. The 3-year contract with Dry Creek Ranch was the anchor of her business through that summer, and into the fall, the steady, reliable work around which she built everything else, and she performed it with the same professional exactness she brought to every commission. Not because Caleb was watching, though sometimes he was, but because the standard she held herself to was not about who was watching. It had never been about who was watching. By the first anniversary of her arrival at the shack, which she noted privately and without ceremony, she had 4 regular ranch accounts, a growing civilian clientele in town, 1 apprentice, a girl of 16 named Dora, who had a good eye and better hands than she had known she had until Clara had shown her how to use them, and a set of books that told a story she found, when she looked at them clearly, entirely worth the telling. And on Saturday afternoons in the long light of summer and the early dark of fall and the cold, clear mornings of the Millhaven winter, a man with creek-water eyes rode down the road from Dry Creek Ranch and tied his horse at her gate and walked to wherever she was, which was usually the workshop, and they talked the way they had always talked, and they laughed the way people laugh when they are genuinely at ease with each other, and the thing between them grew in the slow and sturdy way of things built on honest ground. He did not ask her to be anything other than what she was. She did not want him to be anything other than what he was. And what they were together was something neither of them had managed to be separately, not worse, not diminished, not dependent, but more complete, in the way that 2 well-built structures, each sound on its own, create between them a shelter neither could provide alone. The day he asked her properly, it was a Saturday in October, the first cold Saturday of the year, and they were walking along the creek where the cottonwood leaves had gone to gold, and he stopped on the bank, and he said without preamble, because he was a man who said what he meant without decorative approach, "I want to ask you to marry me, not because I think you need me, and not because I need you, though I think I do more than I would have admitted to myself a year ago, but because I want to spend the rest of my life in the company of the most formidable person I have ever had the privilege of knowing, and because I think the work we could do together, the life we could build together, would be something neither of us would regret." Clara Whitmore stood on the bank of the creek in the October light with the gold leaves moving around her and looked at Caleb Boone. And she thought about the spring gala and the lavender dress and the cold, dark road to the shack. She thought about the first candle on the old table and the first morning and the first client and the price on the sign that she had held to without apology. She thought about the midnight storm and the rope and the voice in the wind. She thought about a kitchen fire in November and the truest thing anyone had ever said to her. She thought about a ledger open on a desk and a cold walk home in April and the composure it had taken to place those coins on the desk and walk out with her head up. She thought about the contract on her cutting table with the title written in the space for her name. She thought about all of it, and she thought about this man standing on this riverbank in this October light who had made a significant error and had understood it, genuinely understood it, not as a social formula but as a truth, and who stood before her now not as a supplicant and not as a savior but as exactly what he had said. He wanted to be a partner, an equal, a person who had chosen her freely and completely, and without any agenda except the honest desire to share the road. Yes, she said. It was a simple word. It was the right word. It had been earned by both of them through everything that had preceded it, and it landed between them in the gold October air with the clean and final sound of a thing that is exactly what it is and needs nothing added to it. He took her hand and she let him, and they stood on the bank of the creek in the long light of the afternoon, and the water ran clear and fast over the stones below them, and the cottonwood leaves came down around them in the mild October wind. And somewhere a meadowlark called once bright and clean and clear, as if it too had been waiting for exactly this. She did not need this. She had proven beyond any remaining doubt that she did not need this. She had built her ground, and stood on it, and held her line, and earned every inch of it with her own 2 hands, and the life she had made was whole and real and entirely hers. And she chose this anyway, freely, fully, with all the considered intentionality of a woman who understands that choosing something from strength is not the same as needing it, and that the difference between those 2 things is the difference between a gift and a surrender. She had never once surrendered. She was not surrendering now. She was simply at last choosing.